I did a Q&A on Instagram the other week, and there was a common struggle that quite a few were having, and that struggle was achieving a sharper look in your images. And in this video, I want to point out some things that you might want to consider when it comes to improving your sharpness in your photos. So the first thing I want to say is that some of you might be confusing sharpness for something else. You might be thinking that, oh, my photos aren't sharp, where in fact your photos might be slightly out of focus. They might be looking flat, lacking contrast, making them look dull due to how you've lit your scene. So it's important not to confuse sharpness with focus or the overall look of your image because you might not think it looks crisp enough. In this case, it's important to revisit what sharpness actually means. And the actual definition of sharpness is simply the clarity of detail in an image. So in this video, let's look at some factors that will affect the sharpness of an image overall. Let's firstly address focus. And there are two ways that you can focus on your camera. There's auto or manual. Now, probably a lot of the time when shooting product, especially in the studio, your subject is not moving, it's still. So when it comes to your focus mode, you'll want to ensure that your autofocus is set to one shot if you're using a Canon. The other option is called servo, and that is for when either yourself or your subject is moving. So this can be especially helpful if you're shooting models, for example. So that's one of your camera's main autofocus operations to pay attention to. Other times I find it better to use manual focus, especially if I'm working with smaller products with small labels. This can just help me to ensure that the product label is definitely in focus. Now you can switch your focus to manual mode by pressing this little switch on your lens. And then to adjust your focus, you simply turn your focal ring on your lens and turn it until your product is in focus. And if you're not tethered to a computer, you can use the little magnifier icon on your viewfinder to zoom in to ensure that your products are actually in focus, and this can be very handy. Overall, if you're finding that autofocus isn't quite giving you what you want, switch to manual focus instead to see if you can get your products perfectly in focus. Now, just because your product is in focus, this doesn't mean your image is sharp. And that's why I want to emphasize that focus and sharpness are not the same thing. Now, before we move on, I want to quickly mention the sponsor of today's video, Ana Luisa. Now, I'll be using some of my Ana Luisa pieces in this video to show you some elements that affect sharpness, as especially with jewelry. You want your images to be tacked sharp. I absolutely love how the jewelry comes in these little pockets, and they are so perfect for traveling or just keeping your jewelry organized, especially when it comes to preventing your necklaces from getting all tangled. From their packaging to their pieces, Ana Luisa are also carbon neutral, which for myself as a consumer is something that I really love to see more brands adopting. And their pieces are so affordable as well for the high quality you receive. And with Christmas coming up, their minimal designs really do make perfect gifts. So I feel like you can't really go wrong with minimalistic jewelry. And some key pieces I always have in my jewelry collection include gold necklaces. I'm obsessed, as I think gold necklaces just elevate any kind of look. Small gold hoops, but with a little bit of chunkiness as well, gives a luxurious vibe, and either a minimal or statement gold ring. Whether you want something that looks sleek or bold, it's nice to have both options. And they have so many elegant designs that will give you a lot of versatility in your style as well. Honestly, because I work from home all the time, I don't usually wear makeup, I don't look like this. I even forego brushing my hair most mornings, and just putting on a gold necklace somehow makes me feel like I have a bit more of my life together. It's like when you put on makeup, you feel like you're ready for your day. So it's just something that makes me feel good and luxe, and we love that. So if you want to check out their sustainable designs, have a browse through their website. They also have super fast shipping times as well, and they do ship internationally. I have a discount code for you which will give you 10% off, and I'll leave that code and the link to their website in the description box below. Now let's get back to the video. So we can dive into the topic that focus is not the same as sharpness by talking more about how your lens and your aperture can affect the sharpness of your image. So you might find the more you increase your aperture, let's say up to f20, f30, you start to lose a bit of sharpness in your image compared to, say, if you shoot the same image at an f-stop of 6. In other words, the image you shot at an f-stop of 6 appears sharper than the image at the f-stop of 20. And this has something to do with a term called diffraction. Now, I'm not going to go and talk about the technicalities of diffraction because honestly, it's a lot and I don't fully understand all of it myself, but I've grasped the basics. Essentially, it has to do with how light passes through a lens. If you want to read about diffraction, I've linked a super helpful article below in the description box that explains it and goes into the science of diffraction. So let's hop inside Photoshop and I'll show you a visual example of what I'm talking about here. So here we are inside of Photoshop and I have two images, this one and this one. These aren't edited, it's just for demonstration purposes only. I'm not gonna edit these. This photo was taken at an f-stop of f25. So let's zoom in a little bit. Now I'm looking at this area here of the earring. This to me isn't tack sharp when I'm comparing it to the other image. So let's have a look at the other image here. This photo was actually shot using continuous light, the other was strobe, and this was shot at f.56. So I can already tell this is sharper. I'm looking at this part of the earring and I definitely think that is sharper than this image here. And you'd probably agree with me now that you can see the side by side. Let's have a look at the necklace. So let's look at this little section here. And now let's jump into this other image. This is definitely more tack sharp to my eye. Sharpness can also be a bit subjective as well, but if you look at the difference, I mean, the other one is definitely sharper. Now on this photo here, obviously I can't get everything perfectly in focus because I'm shooting at an f-stop of 5.6. For example, this section here of the earring is out of focus. So I would have to focus stack in order to get that in focus. Whereas on this image, I do have that a bit more in focus because I was shooting at such a high aperture. So I think this visual comparison nicely explains how diffraction can work and that the higher the aperture, the less sharp your image might actually be. So, does this mean that you shouldn't shoot at an f-stop of 20? No, I often shoot at an f-stop of about 20, so I can get more of my scene in focus, especially if I'm shooting multiple products. What I can then do is add sharpening in post-production. Now, if you wanted to shoot at an f-stop of say 6 and things are looking sharp, but you can't get your whole product in focus, then your two choices are to either expand your depth of field by increasing your aperture or focus stack your image. So you take multiple photos at different focal points and stack them together inside of Photoshop. So when you are shooting your scene, just look at your scene, look at your camera settings, look at your light, and decide what is going to be best for that photo. Now let's address how shutter speed impacts the sharpness of your image. So if your shutter speed is too slow, this can easily introduce motion blur into your image. So even though you've perfectly focused on your subject, your shutter speed could affect whether that photo comes out blurry or not. So for product photography, I tend to shoot around 1/250. I found this to be a nice shutter speed for still life work, and honestly don't deviate much from this when I'm in the studio with a controlled artificial light setup. And there are two other factors that can interfere with motion blur. And when you press the shutter button, even if your camera is on a tripod, this can actually introduce a tiny bit of movement to the camera. Most of the time for myself, I don't find this to be an issue, but just be aware this can be a factor when shooting. If you find that's an issue, put your camera on a 2-second timer and this will allow for absolutely zero motion. And the other factor is whether or not you're using a tripod or going handheld. Now, if you're hand holding a camera, a couple small tips is to make sure to keep your elbows in and feet shoulder width apart for extra stabilization. And before you take a photo, take a deep breath in. Press the shutter button before you exhale. this helps to give your body a bit of extra stabilization if you need it. Otherwise, using a tripod wherever you can will help you to minimize any chance of motion interference. The next thing that can affect the sharpness of your image is light. Essentially, make sure that you have enough light coming into your scene. If your image is either too under or overexposed, you're going to lose information and detail in those areas of the photo. Therefore, it won't look as sharp as you'd like. So when you're setting up your lights, take your time to find the right balance of camera and light settings to ensure you're happy with how your scene has been lit. And honestly, this is why flash or strobes are amazing for product photography, because they're brighter than continuous lights. And that's not to say you can't use continuous or natural lighting, which you absolutely can, and you can get some incredible results with those types of lighting. But if you've ever gone from continuous light to strobe lighting, you'll know the amazing difference that strobe lighting can make to your scene. And I definitely experienced this myself when I went from continuous to strobe lighting, and I was like, why did I not do this sooner? Because the results in camera are just, they're so much better when you use strobes. Now, the next thing to pay attention to ensure that your images are sharp, and this is a very quick and easy tip, is whether or not your lens and your sensor is actually clean. If you've got any dust, marks, scratches on your lens, and make sure to check both sides of your lens or your camera sensor, then this can show up on your image. So ensure to keep your gear clean. Another factor that can affect sharpness of your image is the gear you're using and the quality of your camera and your lens. I'm not gonna say this makes the biggest difference in your images, as I believe you can still capture sharp images with a budget setup, but it does help to have good gear. And I have definitely experienced this with upgrading my own gear over time, especially when I upgraded to my Canon R5. When it comes to your camera, the size of the sensor can impact the sharpness. The larger the sensor, the more detail you can capture in the image, because the sensor size determines the amount of light that makes up your image. So the larger the sensor, the more information or detail you can render in a photo. And as we have defined before, sharpness is clarity of detail in a photo. So let's have a look at a mobile phone photo versus my Canon R5. You're going to get a lot more detail because my Canon has a larger sensor than my iPhone. So here we are back in Photoshop, and I have an iPhone photo here, and then I've got a photo taken on my Canon R5 using a 100mm macro lens. We're just gonna have a look at the difference in clarity of detail in these images. So if we zoom in here, this is the iPhone photo. And I mean, if you were posting this on social media, it's probably not the biggest deal in the world, but we're in the industry of commercial photography here. So if we zoom in, you can see there's not a whole ton of clarity of detail in this earring. Like you can see that right there. If we hop over to the Canon R5 image, let's just zoom in. You can see there's a lot more detail captured in the pieces. So you can see that there's quite a big difference in how sharp and how clear the detail is between the iPhone photo and the Canon R5. And honestly, if you're doing commercial photography and you don't have a camera yet, I highly recommend upgrade to a camera, because you will get higher quality images than if you were shooting on just an iPhone. The next thing to consider that might be affecting your sharpness is whether or not you need to calibrate your lens. So when we buy a new lens, we pretty much assume it's going to focus perfectly from the moment we put it on our camera until the end of time, which may not be the case. And this could be a key reason why your images are looking a little blurry if you've never done this before. Essentially, when you autofocus, it just might not be super duper sharp. I've personally never had to do this, but if you find this could be an issue, simply search lens calibration in YouTube and heaps of tutorials will pop up for you. Now, there are a few things you can do in post-production to save your image if it comes out a tiny bit blurry or not sharp. Of course, I always recommend to firstly check your images in camera as you shoot, as sometimes an image cannot always be saved depending on how bad the blur is. There are some general sharpening techniques that you can apply to your images in both Lightroom and Photoshop. In Lightroom, I usually bump up the texture and the clarity to help create a sharper image. And in Photoshop, you can use high pass sharpening to add extra sharpness to your images, which I pretty much do with every image that I edit. It's a great little trick. So those are some elements that can affect the sharpness of your images. If I've missed any, please feel free to leave them in the comments. And if you want to check out any of the Ana Luisa pieces, I've left that link in the description box below for you. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video.